If you will not go to a nursing home, pack a bag and get out of my house right now." Bradley's face was flushed red, the veins in his neck popping against his skin as he screamed those words directly into my face. Behind him, my daughter-in-law Monica stood with her arms crossed over her chest, a cold, calculated smirk playing on her lips. She was enjoying this moment. She had been waiting for this moment for 3 years. But I did not cry. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not beg. I am 70 years old, and for 40 years I worked as a structural engineer. I have spent my entire life measuring stress points, identifying load-bearing walls, and calculating the exact millisecond a rotten foundation is about to collapse. I knew exactly what I was looking at right now, so I stayed perfectly calm. I smiled at my son, folded the last dress shirt into my suitcase, and snapped the latches shut with a sharp, decisive click. Exactly 1 hour later, the deep purr of a massive engine broke the silence of the neighborhood. A black armored Maybach limousine glided into the driveway of our Weston, Massachusetts estate. I watched from the second-floor window as Bradley rushed out the front door, frantically smoothing his expensive silk tie. He always was a social climber, eager to network with whatever VIP had unexpectedly arrived at his doorstep. But his arrogant, eager smile vanished in an instant. It was replaced by absolute paralyzing terror when the billionaire stepped out of the back seat, ignored Bradley completely, and opened the car door for me. Before I tell you exactly how I brought my own ungrateful son to his knees, please let me know where you are watching this video from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel right now if you have ever had to stand up to a family member who severely underestimated your worth. Your support means the world to me. How did a father who gave his only son absolutely everything end up being thrown out on the street like yesterday's garbage? To understand that, we need to rewind the clock exactly 72 hours earlier. I was sitting alone in the guest room of a $2.5 million home in one of the wealthiest suburbs in the state. I call it the guest room because despite the fact that I paid for 80% of the down payment out of my own pocket 3 years ago, Bradley and Monica never let me forget that I was just a temporary visitor in their picture-perfect lives. After my wife passed away, I sold our family home. I gave Bradley the bulk of my life savings so he could afford this mansion. He looked me in the eyes back then and promised I would always have a place with them, a secure, loving home for my twilight years. That promise turned out to be the biggest lie of my life. It was a quiet Thursday morning, or at least it started that way. The heavy oak door to my room suddenly flew open, hitting the drywall with a loud, violent bang. Bradley stormed inside, his face contorted in anger. He marched over to my bed and threw a glossy, cheap-looking brochure right onto my lap. It landed face up. The bold letters on the front read, "Sunset Pines." I felt a cold chill wash over me. I knew that name. Everyone in our county knew that name. It was a notoriously grim, severely underfunded state facility where elderly people with no money and no family were sent to be completely forgotten. It smelled of bleach and despair, a place of no return. I looked up at my son, genuinely confused. "What is this supposed to mean, Bradley?" I asked, my voice calm but guarded. He slammed his hand down hard against the top of my wooden dresser. "Do not play dumb with me, Dad," he shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at my face. "You backed your car right into my new Tesla this morning. You left a massive scratch across the entire rear bumper, and you did not even realize it. You are losing your mind. Your memory is failing, and you are becoming a dangerous liability to this family and to this entire neighborhood." I sat there on the edge of the bed, trying to process the absolute absurdity of his words. My mind was, and still is, perfectly sharp. I still solve complex structural calculus equations every single night before bed just to keep my brain in top condition. I knew for an absolute fact that I had not driven my car in 3 days. I slowly turned my head and glanced over at my nightstand. My car keys were sitting in the exact same spot I had left them on Monday, covered in a very thin, undisturbed layer of dust. I stood up, walked past my fuming son, and looked out the bedroom window down to the driveway. Sure enough, there was a fresh, nasty scrape on the dark paint of his expensive Tesla. But even from the second floor, my trained eyes noticed the detail he missed. The paint transfer deep inside the scratch was bright white. My car is silver. Monica drives a large white SUV. This is a setup I realized with crystal clarity. But before I could point out the physical evidence of his lie, Bradley reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He tossed them onto the dresser next to my keys. It was a full medical proxy and a power of attorney. "Sign this," he demanded, shoving a black pen toward my chest. "Sign this right now. It gives me full medical and legal guardianship over your affairs. I have already booked the secure transport van from Sunset Pines. They are coming to pick you up on Friday afternoon, and you are going to it quietly." I stared at the paperwork, the bold legal jargon designed to strip away my entire existence. Then I looked at my son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the boy whose expensive college tuition I had worked double shifts and weekends to pay off without a single complaint. "I will not sign this," I said, keeping my voice incredibly low and steady, projecting an authority I refused to surrender. "You are completely out of your mind if you think I belong in a locked facility." Right on cue, Monica stepped into the room. Her expensive designer heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor that my money had paid to install. She pulled her cell phone out of her pocket, tapping the bright screen with her perfectly manicured nails. "Then we will just have to do this the hard way," she said, her voice dripping with absolute ice. "I just dialed 911. I have not pressed the call button yet. But if you do not sign that paper in the next 10 seconds, I will call the police dispatch. I will tell them we have a hostile, confused and aggressive squatter who is violently refusing to leave our property. After all, Harrison, your name is not on the primary residential deed, is it?" She was right about that one specific detail. 3 years ago, in a moment of foolish blind trust, I had allowed them to keep my name off the primary deed, to secure them a significant tax break. I had trusted my own flesh and blood to honor our verbal agreement. Now they were weaponizing my own generosity to throw me out onto the street. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the walls. I bought looking at the two people I had sacrificed my career and my life savings to support. I did not argue the law. I did not scream back or throw a tantrum. A good engineer knows that when a structure is compromised, you do not punch the walls. You step back, assess the damage, and find the critical load-bearing pillar to dismantle. I simply looked Bradley directly in his eyes, refusing to blink, and said, "Give me 3 days to sort my affairs and pack my things." They looked at each other smug and victorious, believing they had just easily won the war. But they had absolutely no idea who they were truly dealing with. They thought I was a broken old man. They did not realize that I had already begun to inspect their structural integrity, and I was about to meticulously bring their entire fraudulent house crashing down around them. The heavy silence in the guest room shattered the moment Bradley slapped a thick stack of stapled papers onto my oak dresser. The sharp smack echoed off the walls. I did not flinch. I kept my posture straight and my breathing even, watching him with the quiet intensity I used to reserve for inspecting compromised steel beams. He pointed a trembling finger right at my chest. He yelled that my mind was completely gone and that I was living in a dangerous state of delusion. He claimed that barely an hour ago I had carelessly reversed my silver sedan straight into the rear quarter panel of his brand-new Tesla Model S. According to him, I caused thousands of dollars in structural damage and simply drove away without even noticing. He called it a textbook hit and run. He shouted that the neighbors were terrified of me whispering about the crazy old man who could not even navigate a simple suburban driveway without destroying property. His performance was incredibly loud and intensely aggressive. It was a masterclass in intimidation. If I were truly a frail, confused senior citizen, I would have crumbled right then and there. I would have doubted my own memory and surrendered to his overwhelming guilt trip. But my mind is a highly functional steel trap. I do not make careless mistakes, and I certainly do not hit stationary objects in broad daylight. I did not immediately respond to his explosive accusations. Instead, I slowly turned my head and looked at my nightstand. My car keys rested exactly where I had placed them the previous evening at 8 o'clock. They were sitting perfectly parallel to the edge of the wooden table. There was a thin, completely undisturbed layer of morning dust settling around the metal keyring. Those keys had not moved an inch. I had not left the house at all this morning. I had been sitting in my reading chair drinking black coffee. Bradley saw me looking at the keys. He immediately stepped into my line of sight, blocking my view of the nightstand, trying to command my entire field of vision. He lowered his voice, shifting his tone from pure rage to a sickeningly fake pitch of deep concern. He told me that this was exactly what dementia looked like. He said people with Alzheimer's disease often perform highly complex tasks like driving a vehicle and causing a severe accident, only to completely forget the entire sequence of events minutes later. He tried to gaslight me into believing that my own brain was rapidly rotting away. He insisted that I was a liability not just to the family, but to the entire Weston community. He painted a terrifying picture of me crashing into a storefront because my cognitive functions were deteriorating. It was a highly calculated psychological assault. He was trying to dismantle my confidence brick by brick. Then he tapped his manicured index finger against the stack of papers he had slammed onto my dresser. He commanded me to look at the top page. It was a full medical proxy and a durable power of attorney. The legal language was printed in dense, unforgiving paragraphs. I did not need a law degree to understand what those documents represented. They were designed to completely strip away my sovereignty as a human being. If I signed that paper, I would instantly surrender every single legal, financial, and medical right I possessed directly to my son. I would no longer be able to make choices about my own health care. I would not be able to manage my own bank accounts. I would effectively become a legal infant under his total jurisdiction. Bradley pulled a silver pen from his tailored suit jacket and forcefully pressed it into my hand. He told me the time for negotiation was officially over. He stated that he had already made all the necessary arrangements for my own safety. He revealed that he had officially booked a secure transport van from Sunset Pines. The vehicle was scheduled to arrive at our curb exactly at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon. He told me that the nursing home staff was fully briefed on my aggressive tendencies and my severe memory loss. He promised that if I simply signed the documents and went quietly, he would ensure I received a room with a window. If I fought him, he warned that the transition would be highly unpleasant and incredibly embarrassing for me. Monica remained standing firmly in the doorway, her arms crossed tight, acting as his silent, menacing enforcer. She did not say a word, but her cold gaze communicated absolute zero empathy. They wanted me erased. I did not look at this pen in my hand. I did not look at the heavy legal documents waiting to steal my freedom. I simply took a slow, deliberate breath, stepped around my son, and walked straight toward the large bay window that overlooked the front property. Bradley stopped talking. The sudden silence in the room was heavy and thick. He watched me with nervous uncertainty, clearly confused by my total lack of panic. I looked down at the wide paved driveway. His sleek, dark blue Tesla was parked at an odd angle. From the second-floor vantage point, the morning sunlight hit the rear quarter panel, perfectly illuminating the damage. There was indeed a massive, ugly scrape tearing through the expensive clear coat. It was a deep, jagged wound in the metal. But my eyes are trained to spot structural inconsistencies. I focused intensely on the point of impact. Deep inside the grooves of the destroyed blue paint caught in the jagged edges of the metal were distinct, unmistakable streaks of bright white paint transfer. My personal vehicle, which had not moved from the garage, is metallic silver. Monica drives a large, heavy pearl-white luxury SUV. The sheer gravity of the situation locked into place like the final piece of a complex engineering puzzle. This was not a random misunderstanding. This was a highly premeditated, meticulously coordinated setup. Monica had clearly misjudged her turning radius that morning and backed her heavy white SUV straight into her husband's prized vehicle. Instead of admitting fault, they had instantly weaponized her mistake. They recognized the perfect opportunity to manufacture a crisis. They desperately needed a tangible event to justify their sudden aggressive push to lock me inside a state-funded dementia ward. They needed a documented incident to prove to any questioning authority that I was a genuine hazard to myself and others. The scratch on the bumper was their fabricated smoking gun. They were going to use Monica's careless driving error as the ultimate leverage to terrorize me into signing away my life, my freedom, and my assets. They believed they had constructed an airtight narrative. They thought I was just a frightened, clueless old man who would buckle under the pressure of their perfectly timed threats. But they made a fatal miscalculation. They forgot that I spent my entire career diagnosing structural failures. I saw right through their cheap, perfectly fabricated facade. I knew exactly what they were doing to me, and my retaliation would be absolute. I looked directly into my son's eyes and let the heavy silence stretch between us. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight. I simply stared at him until his arrogant posture began to subtly falter. Then I spoke with a quiet, undeniable, absolute certainty. I will not sign a single page of your fabricated garbage, and I will not be stepping foot inside any transport van. Bradley's face went rigid. For a split second, he looked like a panicked child whose elaborate lie had just been exposed. But that hesitation vanished instantly, replaced by a dark, volatile fury. He opened his mouth to shout another barrage of empty threats, ready to escalate his performance to a terrifying new level. Before he could unleash his temper, Monica stepped around him. She moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, completely taking control of the physical space in the room. She reached into the pocket of her pristine designer slacks and pulled out her smartphone. The screen was already glowing bright. With a sharp theatrical gesture, she tossed the phone onto the smooth surface of the wooden dresser. It landed right next to the medical proxy, the screen facing up so I could clearly see the illuminated numbers. She had dialed 911. The green call button was hovering right there, waiting for a single tap. Monica leaned forward, resting her hands on the dresser, and locked her gaze with mine. Her voice was no longer loud or hysterical. It was entirely flat, entirely devoid of any human warmth. It was the voice of a predator who had successfully cornered her prey. She told me that she was one tap away from connecting with the emergency police dispatcher. She stated with absolute zero hesitation that she would calmly report a hostile, deeply confused individual trespassing inside her home. She promised to tell the arriving officers that I was becoming violently erratic, that I had already destroyed their property, and that I was completely refusing to vacate the premises. I felt a cold, metallic knot tighten deep inside my stomach. I knew exactly what she was implying. 3 years ago, when we sat down at the closing table for this massive estate, I had made a decision born out of pure paternal generosity. Bradley had begged me to leave my name off the primary residential deed. He presented an incredibly detailed financial argument, claiming that a first-time homeowner tax credit and specific municipal exemptions would save them tens of thousands of dollars over the next decade. He promised me, looking me right in the eyes, that my financial contribution would be privately recorded and that my permanent residency was an unshakable guarantee. I had written a check covering 80% of the purchase price, handing them the keys to a kingdom they could never afford. Now Monica was staring at me, weaponizing that exact sacrifice. She reminded me, speaking very slowly, so I would grasp the full gravity of the situation, that my name did not exist on any municipal property record. As far as the local police department was concerned, I was not a homeowner. I was not an investor. I was nothing more than an unregistered guest who had severely overstayed his welcome. If she pushed that green button, heavily armed officers would arrive within minutes. They would not ask to see my bank transfers from 3 years ago. They would simply check the official deed, see only Bradley and Monica listed as the legal owners, and order me to leave. If I resisted, if I tried to explain the complex financial history, they would look at the damaged Tesla, listen to Monica's fabricated story about my failing mind, and they would forcefully remove me from the property. I would be dragged out of my own investment in handcuffs, humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood, and forcibly transported to a hospital for a mandatory psychological evaluation. It was a flawlessly designed trap. They had anticipated every single angle of my resistance, constructing a scenario where any aggressive defense would only validate their false narrative of my mental decline. If I shouted, I was crazy. If I fought back, I was dangerous. If I but called them liars, I was experiencing severe cognitive dissonance. They had essentially backed me into a corner where the only viable option seemed to be total surrender. Bradley crossed his arms, regaining his arrogant swagger as he watched Monica expertly deliver the final blow. He looked incredibly proud of her ruthlessness. He looked at me as if I were a decaying piece of furniture they were finally throwing out onto the curb. He told me that I was entirely out of options. He instructed me to pick up the pen sign, the medical proxy, and save myself the absolute embarrassment of a police escort. I stood there feeling the rhythmic, steady beat of my own heart against my ribs. I did not feel fear. I did not feel panic. What I felt was a profound, chilling clarity. I realized that the son I had raised was completely gone, replaced by a greedy, manipulative stranger who would happily destroy my life to preserve his own comfort. The woman standing next to him was a willing, eager accomplice. They had spent 3 entire years dining at my table, spending my money, and smiling in my face, all while secretly resenting my existence. A lesser man would have exploded. A lesser man would have grabbed the phone, screamed at the top of his lungs, and demanded basic human respect. But 40 years of engineering had taught me one absolute universal truth. When you find yourself standing inside a rapidly collapsing structure, you do not waste your precious energy screaming at the walls. You calculate your exit strategy, you gather your resources, and you systematically prepare to detonate the entire foundation from a safe distance. I knew that engaging in a screaming match over a legal deed would accomplish absolutely nothing. I needed time. I needed a window of opportunity to pivot from defense to offense. I needed to move the battlefield completely out of their controlled environment. I slowly reached out, moving my hand deliberately toward the dresser. I saw Bradley tense up, his eyes darting to the medical proxy, clearly anticipating my total capitulation. He genuinely believed his psychological warfare had succeeded. He thought he had officially broken my spirit. Instead of picking up the silver pen, I simply placed my hand flat against the cool wood of the dresser. I looked away from the documents and fixed my gaze firmly on my son. I kept my expression entirely neutral, completely devoid of any emotion they could possibly analyze or interpret. I did not show anger. I did not show defeat. "Give me 3 days," I said. My voice was smooth, quiet, and carried a definitive authority that commanded the room. Bradley blinked, clearly thrown off balance by the sudden shift in my demeanor. He exchanged a very quick, uncertain glance with Monica. She frowned, clearly suspicious of my calm reaction, but the prospect of a peaceful victory was incredibly tempting. "Give me 3 days to sort my affairs, pack my belongings, and arrange my personal items," I continued, keeping my tone perfectly measured. "If you give me 72 hours of complete uninterrupted peace, I will not fight you. You will not have to call the police, and there will be no embarrassing public spectacle." I watched the rapid calculation happen behind Monica's eyes. She weighed the immediate satisfaction of calling the police against the massive hassle of a physical altercation and a messy legal removal. She looked at the medical proxy, then back at me. 3 days, she repeated, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. "You have until Friday morning. If you are not completely packed and ready to cooperate when that transport van arrives, I am making the call. And I promise you, Harrison, it will not be pretty." I nodded once, a single sharp motion of agreement. "I understand the parameters," I replied smoothly. Bradley let out a long, dramatic sigh of relief, clearly thrilled that the confrontation had supposedly ended in his favor. He reached forward and snatched the medical proxy off the dresser, tucking it safely back into his jacket pocket. "We are doing this because we love you, Dad," he said, attempting to inject a pathetic sliver of fake warmth back into his voice. "Someday you will understand that this is for the best." I did not respond to his hollow, sickening words. I simply turned my back to them, walked over to my closet, and opened the double doors. I stood there staring at my neatly hanging clothes, waiting for them to leave. I heard the sharp click of Monica's heels retreating down the hallway, followed by Bradley's heavy footsteps. The bedroom door closed with a soft, final click. I was entirely alone. The immediate threat was gone, but the countdown had officially started. They had generously given me exactly 72 hours to pack my bags. They believed I was going to use that time to quietly surrender to my grim, pathetic fate. They were absolutely wrong. I was going to use those 72 hours to engineer their total financial and personal ruin. The first phase of my retaliation was about to begin, and I knew exactly where to start. The sun rose over the lawns of Weston, casting long shadows across my bedroom floor. I had been awake since 4. A lifetime of structural engineering trains your brain to wake up early and review blueprints. Today, the blueprint I was reviewing was the psychological architecture of my son. I remained seated in my reading chair, dressed in tailored trousers and a pressed shirt. I did not pack a single sock. I simply waited. I knew Bradley and Monica would not leave things at a stalemate. Their aggressive assault yesterday had failed to produce an immediate signature, which meant they had to pivot. When brute force fails to bring down a load-bearing wall, a demolition crew will try to undermine the foundation. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy oak door slowly creaked open. There was no violent bang this time. There was no shouting about scratched bumpers. Bradley stepped into the room holding a steaming mug of black coffee. He was dressed in his tailored suit, ready for his day as a chief executive, but his posture was deliberately slumped. He walked toward me with hesitant steps, projecting deep exhaustion and profound sadness. He placed the coffee mug on the wooden table beside my chair. Then, to my absolute astonishment, my 40-year-old son lowered himself to the floor and kneeled right beside my chair. He placed his hands gently over my knees. He looked up at me, his eyes shining with manufactured tears. It was a theatrical performance. "Dad, I am so incredibly sorry about how I acted yesterday," Bradley whispered, his voice trembling with practiced emotion. I was completely out of line. I was shouting because I was terrified, and I let my fear get the best of me. "Please forgive me." I looked down at his perfectly styled hair and his expensive cologne, keeping my face completely blank. Terrified of what Bradley, I asked, keeping my tone soft and vulnerable. A single tear escaped his eye and rolled down his cheek. He squeezed my knees tighter. "Terrified for you, Dad. Terrified of losing you." He took a deep, shaky breath as if the words were physically painful. "Do you not remember what happened last Tuesday afternoon? You were alone in the kitchen while Monica was out. You turned on the gas stove to boil water for tea and completely forgot about it. You left the open flame burning for hours. The water boiled away, the kettle scorched, and the entire downstairs was filling with gas. Monica came home just in time to shut it off. You nearly burned the house down, Dad. We could have lost you." I sat perfectly still, listening to the tragic story my son was spinning. It was an emotionally devastating narrative, designed to make me question my own grip on reality. There was only one massive, undeniable flaw in his meticulously constructed lie. As the primary financial backer of this entire estate, I had personally reviewed every single architectural blueprint and appliance invoice 3 years ago. The kitchen in this house does not have a gas stove. It is equipped with a state-of-the-art magnetic induction cooktop. It operates entirely on electromagnetic fields. It does not use an open flame, and there are absolutely no gas lines running into that kitchen. It is physically impossible to leave a gas burner on in a kitchen running entirely on electricity. I did not point out this glaring engineering impossibility. I let him continue to dig his own grave. Bradley wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, playing the role of the exhausted, loving son to absolute perfection. We did not want to upset you, Dad. We wanted to handle this privately. I sent your recent medical history to a private specialist in Boston, a doctor who specializes in cognitive decline. He reviewed everything, and he confirmed our worst fears. You are showing signs of early-onset Alzheimer's. Your brain is rapidly deteriorating, and it is no longer safe for you to be left alone for even a minute. Bradley shifted his weight, resting his head against my arm. I am a busy executive, Dad. I am working 80-hour weeks to keep this family afloat. Monica is overwhelmed trying to manage this massive house. We do not have the medical training required to give you the 24-hour supervision you desperately need. We love you too much to watch you accidentally hurt yourself. That medical proxy is not about taking away your freedom. It is just a legal formality, so I can manage your pension and ensure your medical bills are paid without you having to stress over the confusing paperwork. Sunset Pines is a wonderful facility. You will have doctors checking on you every day, and we will come visit you every weekend. Please, Dad, let me take care of you. Let me carry this burden so you can just rest. The sheer magnitude of his deception was breathtaking. He was not just greedy. The elaborate nature of this lie, the desperate push to seize absolute control of my finances, indicated something much darker. A man does not invent a fake gas leak and a phantom medical diagnosis just because he wants to remodel a guest bedroom. Bradley was in deep, catastrophic trouble, and my retirement accounts were his only lifeline. I needed him to believe that his emotional manipulation had worked. I needed him to drop his guard completely so I could move freely over the next 2 days. I slowly lifted my right hand. I relaxed the tendons in my wrist, allowing my fingers to shake and tremble with the frailty of a broken, frightened old man. I reached out and gently rested my trembling hand on top of his head. I forced my eyes to widen, mimicking a look of confusion and sorrow. I did not know about the stove, Bradley, I whispered, letting my voice crack. I swear to you, I do not remember any of that happening. Am I really getting that sick? Bradley looked up at me, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of victory. He squeezed my arm, nodding. It is okay, Dad. It is the disease. It is not your fault. You just need to trust me now. I will handle everything. I slowly pulled my trembling hand back and reached for the black coffee. I lifted the ceramic mug with both hands, letting it rattle against my teeth as I took a small sip. I looked down at him, projecting submission. Okay, son, I murmured, staring at the floor. If the doctor says I am a danger, I will not fight you anymore. Just give me until tomorrow night to gather my photos and say goodbye to this room. I will sign your proxy on Friday morning before the van arrives. Bradley stood up, brushing off his suit pants, vibrating with relief. He kissed my forehead, told me he loved me, and walked out of the room, believing he had won the war. He had no idea that I had just handed him a loaded grenade and the pin was already pulled. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving me completely alone in the silent bedroom. The moment I heard Bradley's footsteps fade down the long, carpeted hallway, the trembling in my hands instantly ceased. I set the ceramic coffee mug down onto the nightstand with a firm, steady movement. The fragile, frightened old man routine evaporated, replaced by the cold, calculating mind of a structural engineer. I sat in my reading chair for hours, staring out the large bay window as the bright morning sun slowly transitioned into a deep, heavy twilight. The shadows stretched across the manicured lawns of the Weston estate, mirroring the dark reality settling over my own life. My only son had just delivered an Academy Award-winning performance, completely fabricating a deadly gas leak and a phantom medical diagnosis, all to legally hijack my existence. I did not shed a single tear. The deep, agonizing sorrow of a betrayed father had already burned away, leaving behind nothing but pure, unadulterated focus. When the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed midnight, a sudden thirst pulled me from my intense concentration. My throat was dry. I decided to make my way down to the kitchen for a glass of ice water. I opened my bedroom door with practiced caution, ensuring the metal hinges made absolutely no sound. The sprawling $2.5 million house was enveloped in complete darkness. I navigated the wide, sweeping staircase with perfect precision, stepping carefully to avoid the single creaking floorboard on the third step from the bottom. I knew the exact layout of this massive structure because I had meticulously reviewed the architectural blueprints before writing the check that made this entire lifestyle possible for them. I moved like a ghost through the lavish, silent corridors. As I approached the main foyer leading toward the custom kitchen, I stopped dead in my tracks. A faint glowing sliver of warm light was spilling out from beneath the heavy double doors of Bradley's private home office. I held my breath, listening intently to the absolute silence of the house. Then a sharp, distinct sound cut through the quiet air. It was the unmistakable, crystal-clear clink of expensive champagne flutes tapping together in a celebratory toast. My son and his wife were not asleep. They were wide awake and they were celebrating. I silently changed my trajectory, abandoning my trip to the kitchen, and crept slowly toward the glowing crack beneath the office doors. I pressed my right shoulder against the smooth wooden doorframe and leaned my head forward, bringing my ear mere inches from the narrow opening. The acoustic insulation in this house was excellent, but they were speaking loudly, completely intoxicated by their perceived victory. I heard Monica let out a sharp, hysterical burst of laughter. It was a vicious, mocking sound that echoed off the mahogany walls of the office. "The old fool actually bought it," she crowed, her voice dripping with sheer venomous delight. "I cannot believe he fell for the gas stove story without asking a single question." He was practically shaking in his slippers. I listened as Bradley chuckled, a low, arrogant sound of total self-satisfaction. "I told you I could handle him, my son," replied the fake concern, from this morning, entirely absent from his tone. "He is completely broken, Monica. He genuinely thinks his mind is rotting away. He said he will sign the medical proxy on Friday morning right before the transport van gets here. We just have to play the part of the grieving, supportive family for 48 more hours." Monica clinked her glass against his once again. "The minute the ink is completely dry on that proxy document, we wire the rest of his retirement accounts directly into our offshore holding fund." She commanded, her words cutting through the air with absolute ruthless precision. "I already looked at the penalty fees for early withdrawal, and it is a small price to pay to get our hands on that cash. Once the transfer clears, I want you to immediately book those first-class tickets to the Maldives, Brad. We deserve a luxury vacation after putting up with his annoying presence for the last 3 years. We can finally breathe in our own house." I stood frozen in the dark hallway, absorbing the full, horrifying scope of their immediate plan. They were not just trying to force me into a nursing home to take my bedroom. They were actively conspiring to drain every single penny I had worked 40 years to accumulate. Bradley spoke again, his voice casual and completely detached. "The director at Sunset Pines promised me they will process his intake swiftly," he said. "Once he is locked inside the restricted ward, they confiscate all personal communication devices. He will not have a cell phone to call anyone. He will not even be able to contact his former lawyer. By the time he realizes what we actually did with his money, his legal status will be completely neutralized. He will be a ward of the state, and the courts will automatically dismiss any claims he tries to make as the ramblings of a dementia patient. We are completely in the clear, babe." They laughed together once more, a dark, sinister harmony of absolute greed. I had heard enough. I slowly backed away from the office doors, placing my feet with meticulous care until I was safely out of earshot. I turned and walked back up the sweeping staircase, disappearing into the shadows of the massive house. When I returned to the guest room, I closed the door and locked the deadbolt with a soft, definitive click. I walked over to the bay window and stared out at the quiet, tree-lined street. Any lingering trace of paternal hesitation was completely eradicated. The profound sadness of losing my only son evaporated into the cool night air. It was entirely replaced by a cold, hard, unyielding engineering logic. Bradley and Monica believed they had successfully designed the perfect structural collapse of my life. They thought they had identified all my weak points and applied the exact amount of pressure needed to make me crumble. But they were arrogant amateurs playing a very dangerous game against a master architect. If they wanted to completely dismantle my existence, I was going to systematically inspect their structural integrity first. I was going to locate every hidden stress fracture, every hollow pillar, and every rotten beam holding up their luxurious, fraudulent lifestyle. I knew they would never survive a rigorous professional inspection of their financial foundation. I walked over to my leather briefcase and pulled out a small encrypted tablet. I did not need to sleep tonight. I needed to work. I sat down at the small desk in the corner of the room, flipped open the screen, and began to map out the exact sequence of events required to orchestrate their absolute destruction. I opened a secure spreadsheet application and created a new file titled Project Demolition. Every lie they told would be meticulously documented, categorized, and completely weaponized against them. The time for sorrow was over. The time for total retaliation had officially begun. The next 48 hours were an exercise in supreme psychological discipline. I had to maintain the illusion of a rapidly deteriorating old man while operating with the precision of a tactician behind closed doors. By Tuesday morning, the house settled into a tense, expectant quiet. Bradley and Monica acted excessively gentle around me, speaking in slow, patronizing tones, as if I were already a patient in the dementia ward. I played along flawlessly. I shuffled my feet when I walked into the kitchen. I deliberately asked the same question twice during breakfast. I watched the triumphant, cruel glances they secretly exchanged across the imported granite island. They thought I was crumbling exactly on schedule. After breakfast, I retreated to the guest room, locking the heavy wooden door behind me. I moved straight to my vantage point at the large bay window overlooking the expansive front lawn. The Weston neighborhood was normally a portrait of serene, undisturbed wealth. Landscapers in neat uniforms quietly trimmed the hedges, and luxury sedans glided silently down the pristine paved streets. But at exactly 10:15 in the morning, that perfect suburban aesthetic was sharply interrupted. A heavy, unmarked black SUV turned abruptly into our driveway. It did not pull up with the cautious respect of a delivery vehicle or an invited guest. It parked aggressively, the thick tires gripping the expensive paving stones, completely blocking the exit path. The loud engine was cut, and two men stepped out into the bright morning light. My trained eyes immediately began to categorize the visual anomalies. They were not wearing the casual athletic wear typical of affluent suburbanites, nor did they wear the tailored business attire of Bradley's corporate associates. They wore cheap, poorly fitted dark suits that looked completely out of place against the backdrop of a $2.5 million estate. They did not walk toward the front door to ring the bell. Instead, they immediately separated and began a methodical, highly intrusive perimeter check. The taller man pulled out a digital camera and started taking rapid, wide-angle photographs of the primary roofline, the structural facade, and the property boundaries. The second man walked straight up to the large garage and began photographing the exterior walls and the driveway paving. My analytical mind processed their specific movements with absolute clinical detachment. When you hire an appraiser for a home renovation or a bank refinancing, they always knock on your front door. They formally introduce themselves to the owner. They walk through the interior to physically assess the upgraded fixtures and the condition of the living spaces. These two men had absolutely no interest in the interior. They were only documenting the exterior shell and the plot boundaries. I recognized this exact operational pattern from my decades working alongside municipal development boards. These men were aggressive foreclosure scouts. Before the two men could move toward the private backyard, the heavy mahogany front door flew open. Bradley burst out onto the front porch. He was usually incredibly meticulous about his outward appearance, never leaving the house without a perfectly pressed dress shirt and polished shoes. Right now, he was wearing wrinkled gray sweatpants and a loose, stained t-shirt. He was completely barefoot, his feet slapping loudly against the cold stone steps as he sprinted down the driveway. From my second-floor window, I could clearly see the sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from his physical body. He intercepted the taller man, throwing his hands up in the air in a frantic defensive gesture. I pressed my palm against the cool glass of the window, wishing I could hear the audio of their heated exchange. But the body language alone told a comprehensive, terrifying story of absolute financial disaster. Bradley was talking rapidly, his chest heaving, gesturing wildly toward the front of the house, and then pointing aggressively toward the street. He looked exactly like a man desperately begging for his life. The two men in the cheap suits remained entirely unmoved by his explosive emotional display. They did not match his frantic, chaotic energy. They stood perfectly still, their postures rigid, intimidating, and deeply authoritative. The taller man simply shook his head, offering a single cold, dismissive response that seemed to physically deflate my arrogant son. Bradley ran his trembling hands through his uncombed hair, pulling roughly at the roots in a gesture of absolute, total desperation. He was a terrified, cornered animal facing an inescapable trap. The second man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy metal clipboard. He thrust it directly into Bradley's chest, holding out a black pen. Bradley hesitated for a fraction of a second. The taller man instantly stepped forward aggressively, invading Bradley's personal space in a clear physical intimidation tactic. Bradley visibly recoiled, slumping forward in a display of crushing defeat. He slowly reached out and took the pen. Even from 20 feet above, I could see his hands shaking violently as he hastily scribbled his signature onto the legal paperwork. The man snatched the clipboard back, offered absolutely no parting words, and turned sharply on his heel. The two men climbed back into the dark interior of the black SUV. The heavy doors slammed shut, echoing across the quiet lawn, and the massive vehicle reversed rapidly out of the driveway, tearing off down the suburban street. Bradley did not move. He stood barefoot on the paving stones, staring blankly at the empty space. Then his legs seemed to simply give out. He stumbled backward and slumped heavily against the rear bumper of his scratched electric vehicle. He buried his face deep in his shaking hands, his shoulders heaving with silent, ragged breaths. I stepped back from the window, retreating into the deep shadows of my bedroom. The structural integrity of Bradley's curated life was collapsing into dust. Foreclosure scouts do not show up unannounced unless a massive financial default has already occurred. The strict deadline he imposed on me was no longer just a cruel attempt to steal my room. The transport van scheduled for Friday afternoon was a desperate maneuver to physically remove me from the premises before the bank seized the entire property. He needed me locked away in a secure dementia ward, disconnected from the outside world, so I could not legally contest the incoming financial ruin. He was rushing to liquidate whatever assets he could control before lenders completely froze his accounts. My mind raced, calculating the variables. If they were already sending scouts to photograph boundaries, the situation was far more critical than a missed mortgage payment. There was a massive debt hidden beneath the floorboards of this house, and I was sitting directly on top of the blast radius. I needed to uncover the exact numerical value of his failure. I needed to see the hidden paperwork he was trying to conceal. I could not simply sit back and wait. I had to act very aggressively. I walked away from the window and turned my attention toward the heavy door. It was time to stop passively watching the perimeter and start digging directly into the rotten foundation. I knew I could not simply wander the house during daylight. Monica rarely left the estate, and Bradley was currently working from his home office, aggressively pacing the floors and barking desperate commands into his cell phone. I spent the remainder of Tuesday confined to my guest room, maintaining the facade of a broken, frightened elder. I listened to the muffled cadence of their panicked voices seeping through the floorboards. Every time the heavy mahogany stairs creaked, I quickly retreated to my reading chair, draped a blanket over my knees, and adopted a vacant, hollow stare. They checked on me twice. Both times they found exactly what they wanted to see: a defeated man quietly waiting for his impending transport to Sunset Pines. But beneath that carefully constructed mask, my mind was operating at maximum capacity. I was calculating timelines, analyzing behavioral patterns, and waiting for the absolute optimal moment to strike. The house finally went completely dark shortly after midnight. I waited 2 full hours to ensure they had entered a deep restorative sleep. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, I silently rose from my chair. I bypassed my leather dress shoes and slipped into a pair of soft rubber-soled loafers. I dressed in dark slacks and a black sweater. I retrieved a small, heavy-duty tactical flashlight from the bottom of my travel bag. I opened my bedroom door and stepped out into the dark, silent corridor. I navigated the staircase with the same precise, calculated movements I had used the previous night. The massive house felt like a dormant, breathing entity. I bypassed the main living areas and headed straight for the rear utility corridor. I slowly turned the deadbolt on the heavy steel door that connected the mudroom to the primary garage. The air inside the garage was significantly cooler, carrying the faint metallic scent of motor oil and the lingering chemical smell of Bradley's damaged electric vehicle. I kept my flashlight off, relying on the ambient moonlight filtering through the high transom windows to guide my path. I walked past the sleek, damaged sedan and approached the far corner of the massive space. Lined up neatly against the concrete wall were 3 large municipal waste bins. 2 were standard trash receptacles, and the third was a massive blue recycling bin. Bradley was incredibly particular about household waste. He insisted that all sensitive financial documents be shredded before disposal, but he always threw the shredded remains directly into the recycling bin, confident that no one would ever take the time to reconstruct his private affairs. He clearly underestimated the profound patience of a structural engineer. I gripped the heavy plastic handle of the blue recycling container. I carefully tilted the massive bin backward onto its thick rubber wheels. I moved with extreme caution, ensuring the plastic wheels did not rattle or squeak against the smooth concrete floor. I slowly rolled the heavy container away from the exterior wall and maneuvered it toward the center of the garage, positioning it directly underneath my personal workbench. This corner was completely shielded from any interior windows. I engaged the locking mechanism on the bin wheels and finally pressed the rubber button on my tactical flashlight. A sharp, brilliant beam of white light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the chaotic contents of the container. I did not hesitate. I reached directly into the messy pile. The top layer consisted of ordinary household refuse. I pushed aside empty imported wine bottles, discarded glossy magazines, and heavy clumps of damp, discarded coffee grounds. The smell was a sour, bitter mixture of stale alcohol and rotting organic matter. I ignored the physical discomfort. I dug deeper systematically, sifting through the layers of cardboard boxes and plastic packaging. My hands became coated in a sticky, unpleasant residue, but my focus remained absolute. Near the very bottom of the heavy bin, trapped beneath a stack of broken cardboard boxes, I found exactly what I was looking for. There was a thick, compressed mound of uniformly shredded white paper. The strips were thin and jagged, clearly the product of a heavy-duty cross-cut shredder. Someone had desperately attempted to destroy a significant volume of documentation. I carefully scooped the massive handful of shredded paper out of the bin and placed it directly onto the clean wooden surface of my workbench. I brushed the coffee grounds and debris off my sleeves, pulled a roll of clear packing tape from the top drawer of the bench, and pulled up a tall wooden stool. Reconstructing a cross-cut document is not a task for the impatient. It is a grueling, agonizing process of pattern recognition and spatial awareness. For a man who spent 4 decades designing complex load-bearing steel frameworks, it was simply another architectural puzzle. I turned on the small focused drafting lamp attached to the workbench. I began to sort the jagged strips of paper by color thickness and visible ink patterns. The silence of the garage was absolute, broken only by the soft, rhythmic rustling of dry paper sliding across the smooth wooden surface. The first hour was incredibly frustrating. The strips seemed entirely chaotic, a meaningless sea of fragmented letters and numbers. But slowly, the underlying structure began to reveal itself. I matched a partial corporate logo. I aligned the jagged edges of a bold red header. I found a sequence of account numbers and carefully taped them together. By 3 o'clock in the morning, the muscles in my neck were burning, and my eyes ached from staring at the tiny fragmented text under the harsh light. I ignored the physical strain. I worked with cold, relentless precision, piecing together the destroyed foundation of Bradley's life. It took me exactly 3 hours to reconstruct the primary page. At 5 o'clock in the morning, with my fingertips numb and my vision blurring, I finally smoothed down the last strip of clear tape. I leaned back on the wooden stool and shone my flashlight directly onto the reconstructed document. The jagged, taped-together page was an official financial notice. It was not from a standard municipal bank or a traditional mortgage lender. The bold black logo at the top of the page belonged to Apex Capital Solutions, an aggressive, highly predatory shadow lending firm known for financing high-risk, high-yield corporate ventures. I scanned the dense paragraphs, my eyes locking onto the critical numerical data. The document was an official final notice of a catastrophic margin call. Bradley had not just missed a few simple mortgage payments. He had apparently leveraged the entire equity of this sprawling estate, along with his own personal corporate stock options, to secure a massive, highly volatile short-term commercial loan. The market had clearly turned aggressively against him, completely wiping out his leveraged position. The bold red numbers printed at the bottom of the reconstructed page were staggering. Bradley was not just broke. He was completely, irreversibly ruined. The shadow lending firm demanded an immediate cash deposit of $3.2 million. If the funds were not wired by Friday, they would initiate a hostile seizure of all listed collateral. The strict deadline made perfect sense. Bradley was facing an immediate catastrophic financial execution. The shadow lenders were circling the property, ready to tear his life apart by Friday afternoon. If Bradley did not produce over $3 million in liquid cash, he would lose the house, his luxury vehicles, and his curated existence. He needed the medical proxy to gain absolute legal authority over my remaining assets to desperately plug the hole in his sinking ship. But a vital piece of the structural puzzle was still missing. The margin call explained his terrifying timeline, but it did not explain his supreme confidence. My monthly pension checks would not cover the interest on that loan. There was only one financial reservoir deep enough to momentarily satisfy a predator like Apex Capital Solutions. My primary retirement portfolio. I folded the reconstructed margin call notice and secured it inside the hidden compartment of my travel bag. I sat back down at the small wooden desk in the corner of the guest room and pulled my personal encrypted laptop from its protective leather sleeve. I lifted the screen, watching the device hum to life in the quiet darkness. The battery was fully charged, but a small yellow triangle appeared over the network icon. I clicked the diagnostic menu and immediately saw the problem. Bradley had actively reconfigured the estate router, specifically blacklisting the unique hardware address of my personal computer. He had intentionally severed my connection to the outside world, isolating me digitally, just as he intended to isolate me physically at Sunset Pines. It was a remarkably petty and amateurish attempt at containment. My son clearly forgot that long before he was tracking stock market fluctuations, I was writing diagnostic code for automated steel fabrication plants. I simply reached into the side pocket of my briefcase and retrieved a dedicated mobile hotspot device I always carried for remote site inspections. I powered on the small black square, established a secure encrypted tunnel, and connected my laptop directly to a private cellular network. The yellow warning triangle vanished, replaced by a solid, secure connection bar. I was back online, completely invisible to Bradley's monitored network. I opened my secure browser and navigated directly to the institutional portal of my primary wealth management firm. This was the highly protected vault that housed the culmination of 40 hard years of my life. Every bridge I engineered, every contract I secured had been systematically funneled into this single, heavily diversified portfolio. It was a solid conservative nest egg consisting of municipal bonds and liquid cash reserves. The total value sat comfortably just over $2 million. It was the financial armor that guaranteed my complete independence. I had built this specific account with extreme caution over 4 decades, ensuring my future was completely insulated from economic turbulence. It represented my ultimate safety net and my peace of mind. I entered my complex alphanumeric password, retrieved the secondary authentication code from my secure mobile device, and pressed the login button. The screen refreshed, loading the dashboard with agonizing slowness. I leaned forward, resting my hands flat on the desk, waiting for the familiar pie charts and the reassuring 7-figure balance to materialize. The page finally rendered. I stared at the bright, glowing screen. I did not blink. I did not breathe. I simply stared at the bold black numbers displayed prominently at the top of the summary page. The digital account balance was exactly $14.50. I closed my eyes for a single long second, forcefully resetting my vision. I opened them again. The numbers had not changed. $14.50. The massive, immovable foundation of my entire life's work had been completely eradicated. My entire $2 million had simply vanished into thin air. A terrifying, absolute silence descended upon the room. The air in my lungs felt like shattered glass. This was not the sting of an ungrateful child throwing a tantrum. This was a lethal, premeditated strike directly at the core of my survival. I forced my hands to remain steady on the keyboard. I navigated away from the empty summary page and clicked directly into the detailed transaction history. I set the parameter to display the last 90 days. The screen populated with a single massive line item dated exactly 2 months ago. It was a total comprehensive liquidation. I clicked on the transfer receipt to download the official banking logs. The entire $2 million balance had been unceremoniously liquidated, subjected to severe early withdrawal penalties, and wired directly into an aggressively shielded offshore holding account. The authorized signatory was explicitly clear. I scrolled down to the bottom of the official transfer log to view the authorization method. There, stamped on the digital ledger, was my own electronic signature. But I had never authorized this transfer. I had not accessed this specific portfolio in over 6 months. I clicked further into the security metadata, downloading the raw network logs associated with the transaction request. The banking system recorded the exact date, the precise timestamp, and the specific Internet Protocol address from where the final authorization had been executed. I recognized the digital footprint immediately. I did not need to run a trace. The IP address permanently attached to the $2 million theft matched the exact static network router located directly downstairs in Bradley's private home office. The sheer horrifying magnitude of his deception finally locked into absolute clarity. Bradley had not just been planning to rob me. The robbery had already happened. 60 days ago, while he was smiling at me across the large dinner table, he was actively forging my digital credentials and draining my life savings. He had quietly funneled my $2 million into his offshore accounts, likely using my money in a desperate failed attempt to satisfy his aggressive shadow lenders. But my $2 million was absolutely not enough to stop the massive bleeding. The apex predators still wanted another $3 million by Friday. This entire week was not a spontaneous crisis. The scratched bumper, the fake gas leak, and the impending transport van were a carefully engineered cover-up. If I discovered the missing $2 million while I was still a sane, legally competent citizen, I could immediately press severe federal fraud charges. But if I was officially diagnosed with severe dementia, stripped of my legal sovereignty, and locked inside Sunset Pines, the missing money would simply be chalked up to my own failing mind. Who would believe a confused old man claiming his son stole his fortune? Bradley was not just trying to take my money. He was trying to erase my credibility so he could get away with the ultimate crime. I closed the laptop with a soft click. The darkness in the room felt different now. It was a tactical war room. He thought he had outsmarted the old man, but he had made the ultimate fatal miscalculation. He left me with 3 days. I packed the encrypted laptop safely away, my mind already executing the very first phase of my absolute retaliation. Tomorrow morning, the protective gloves were finally coming completely off. When Wednesday morning finally arrived, a profound, undeniable shift settled over the silent estate. I did not practice my trembling hands in the mirror or feign a sudden loss of balance. I stood up with the rigid, perfectly balanced posture of a man entirely reclaiming his total sovereignty. The time for playing the helpless, confused victim was definitively over. I was no longer the fragile senior citizen they intended to manipulate. I was a saboteur operating entirely behind enemy lines. I moved to the window and watched the driveway. Shortly before 10 o'clock, Bradley and Monica emerged from the front door. They were dressed in their usual aggressively expensive casual wear, heading to what they confidently referred to as a brunch meeting. In reality, they were likely meeting their shadow lenders to beg for an extension on their margin call. I watched them climb into Monica's luxury vehicle. The heavy doors shut, the engine hummed to life, and the tires rolled smoothly down the driveway. I waited until the white chassis disappeared around the curve of the manicured street. The moment they were completely out of sight, the sprawling house belonged entirely to me. I turned away from the window and moved to action. Early that morning, I had taken a highly calculated walk to a secure automated delivery locker located just outside our gated community. I had used an anonymous prepaid card to place a rush order the previous day. Now standing alone in my bedroom, I placed the small brown package on my desk and tore away the tape. Inside rested 2 state-of-the-art voice-activated micro-recording devices. They were incredibly small, roughly the size of a standard coat button, but packed an immense technological capability. Their omnidirectional microphones could pick up a whisper from 30 feet away. However, relying on standard internal batteries was an amateur mistake. Batteries die, and I needed an uninterrupted audio feed. I reached under my bed and pulled out a heavy steel box. It was my vintage engineering toolkit, the exact kit I had carried onto construction sites for 4 decades. I unlatched the heavy brass clasps. The familiar smell of machine oil and aged metal filled the room. I selected a precision wire stripper, a specialized micro-soldering iron, and a spool of heavily insulated copper wire. I carefully carried my equipment and the 2 recording devices out of the guest room and marched deliberately down the sweeping mahogany staircase. I headed straight into the center of the formal dining room. This was the central hub of their deception. It was the exact room where they hosted dinner parties, plotted their financial maneuvers, and loudly congratulated themselves. Suspended directly above the mahogany table was an elaborate crystal chandelier. It was an incredibly gaudy fixture, but its complex wiring provided the absolute perfect camouflage for my surveillance operation. I pulled out a heavy dining chair and climbed onto the polished tabletop. I reached up and removed the decorative brass canopy covering the electrical junction box in the ceiling. Exposing the dense cluster of colored wires, I engaged my portable soldering iron. I took the first micro-recorder and cracked open its plastic casing. Using needle-nosed pliers, I entirely bypassed the internal battery and directly spliced the power leads into the primary live wires of the chandelier circuit. This required a delicate, highly specific manipulation of the electrical load. A single mistake would trip the circuit breaker and alert Bradley to a structural anomaly. But my hands were remarkably steady. I fused the connections, wrapped the exposed metal in electrical tape, and secured the recording device flush against the inside of the hollow brass canopy. As long as the house had electricity, the device would draw a continuous, undetectable trickle of power. It would record every word spoken in that room, automatically storing the encrypted audio files onto a secure cloud server. I reattached the brass cover, meticulously wiping away stray fingerprints from the polished metal. The chandelier looked completely undisturbed, but it was now a permanent, invisible witness. I carefully climbed down from the massive dining table, gathered my specialized tools, and moved swiftly toward Bradley's private home office. I turned the cold metal handle and pushed the heavy double doors open. The room smelled strongly of expensive leather and arrogant desperation. This was the exact location where he had digitally forged my personal signature and officially stolen my entire retirement fund. I walked around the massive oak desk and focused my attention entirely on his prized possession. It was an imported custom-made executive leather chair. It was thick, overstuffed, and ridiculously expensive. It was the throne from which he commanded his fraudulent empire. It was also the perfect acoustic environment for my second hidden device. I knelt beside the heavy chair and ran my fingers along the meticulously stitched seams near the lower lumbar support. I pulled an incredibly sharp utility blade from my toolkit. With surgical precision, I sliced through a 2-inch section of the black threading hidden deep within the fold of the leather. I reached my fingers into the soft memory foam padding, creating a secure cavity directly behind the lumbar cushion. I took the second micro recorder. This one I did not wire into an electrical grid, as the chair moved frequently. Instead, I connected it to a flat, high-capacity external battery pack I had modified to fit the tight space. I pushed the entire assembly deep into the foam cavity, ensuring the highly sensitive microphone was pointing outward, positioned perfectly to capture Bradley's voice whenever he sat at his desk to make his frantic, incriminating phone calls. I retrieved a curved upholstery needle and heavy black synthetic thread from my kit. I carefully sewed the 2-inch incision back together. I utilized an advanced hidden locking stitch mimicking the precise tension and pattern of the original factory manufacturing. I pulled the thread, tight-snipped the excess, and rigorously massaged the leather to completely erase any visual evidence of the modification. I stood up and closely inspected the executive chair. It was absolutely flawless. There was no visible bulge, no uneven stitching, and absolutely no indication that the furniture had been structurally compromised. I packed my tools back into the heavy steel box and secured the clasps. I stood in the center of the quiet, sunlit home office and took a deep, satisfying breath. The digital net had been perfectly cast. Every phone call, every panicked argument with the shadow lenders, every single detail of their ongoing conspiracy would now be captured, permanently cataloged, and securely transmitted directly to me. I had completely stripped away their privacy without them even realizing the walls were listening. They believed they were hunting a frail, defenseless old man. They had absolutely no idea they had just willingly stepped into a flawlessly executed, highly sophisticated trap. The structural integrity of their deception was heavily wired for a complete, spectacular demolition. Now all I had to do was patiently sit back, listen to their inevitable panic, and calmly wait for the absolute perfect moment to push the detonator and watch their entire fraudulent world burn. The sun breached the horizon, casting cold light across the lawns of the Weston estate. It was Wednesday morning. I had not slept a single minute yet. My mind was sharper than it had been in a decade. I showered, shaved with meticulous care, and dressed in a comfortable wool sweater and dark slacks. I needed to project the absolute picture of a resigned, melancholic elder, making his final peace with the neighborhood he was about to leave behind. I stepped out of the guest room and walked slowly down the sweeping staircase, letting my footsteps fall heavily. Monica was already in the massive kitchen, pouring expensive imported coffee into a ceramic travel mug. She wore her pristine athletic wear, radiating an aura of nervous energy. She glanced at me over the rim of her cup, her eyes narrowing with inherent suspicion. I kept my shoulders slumped and offered a weak, pathetic sigh. I told her I was going to take a long walk around the neighborhood. I said I needed some fresh air to clear my head and mentally prepare myself for Friday. I deliberately let my voice waver, projecting the picture of defeated resignation. Monica offered a tight, patronizing smile. She told me not to wander too far, warning me that my sense of direction was supposedly failing. She reminded me to be back before noon because the landscapers were coming. I nodded silently, turning my back to her and shuffling slowly toward the heavy mahogany front door. I knew exactly what she would do the moment I stepped outside. Bradley had installed a comprehensive network of high-definition security cameras around the perimeter, including a prominent doorbell camera. Monica would undoubtedly stand in the foyer, watching my live video feed to ensure I was actually taking a harmless stroll. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the wide stone porch. I did not look back. I did not look up at the black lens mounted above the doorframe. I simply began to walk down the long driveway, moving at a painstakingly slow, hesitant pace. I paused at the edge of the property, pretending to admire a large oak tree, allowing the camera to capture a full minute of my pathetic, confused meandering. Then I turned right and began to walk down the quiet suburban street. I kept my head down, but my eyes were constantly tracking the angles of the neighborhood surveillance systems. I knew the exact layout of every single security camera within a half-mile radius. I had casually observed their installations during my daily walks over the past 3 years. I knew that exactly 2 blocks away there was a specific intersection where the sprawling oak branches and the curvature of the road created a massive unmonitored blind spot. It was a rare gap in the wealthy grid where digital eyes could not penetrate. I maintained my agonizingly slow shuffle until I reached the end of the first block. The moment I crossed the invisible boundary line of the final camera's field of view, my entire physical posture transformed. My spine straightened, my shoulders pulled back. The slow, hesitant shuffle instantly vanished, replaced by a long, purposeful, and powerful stride. I checked my wristwatch. It was exactly 8:30 in the morning. My timing was flawless. As I rounded the corner into the dense shadow of the intersection, a dark gray town car was already idling quietly against the curb. It was not a marked city taxi. It was a private executive transport service I had secured using a prepaid cellular device I purchased months ago for anonymous inquiries. I walked briskly to the rear passenger side, opened the heavy door, and slid into the immaculate leather interior. The driver did not ask any questions. I had already provided the destination and paid a significant cash premium for absolute discretion. The car smoothly accelerated, carrying me rapidly away from the toxic estate. I sat back against the dark leather seats and watched the quiet suburban streets dissolve into the busy, chaotic arteries of the highway. We were heading straight into the heart of downtown Boston. The transition from the curated wealth of Weston to the unforgiving steel and glass structures of the financial district mirrored the internal shift within my own mind. I was leaving behind the role of the passive victim and stepping directly onto the battlefield. I closed my eyes and mentally reviewed the complex, highly sensitive documents I had hidden deep within the lining of my briefcase. The reconstructed margin call notice from the shadow lending firm. The digital network logs proving Bradley had illegally accessed my private retirement portal. The undeniable proof that my son had committed severe wire fraud and stolen my $2 million foundation. The heavy town car navigated the congested city traffic, with practiced ease finally pulling up to the curb outside a massive skyscraper located squarely in the center of the financial district. I thanked the driver, stepped out onto the busy pavement, and walked through the heavy revolving glass doors. The lobby was a cathedral of polished marble and brushed steel, humming with the aggressive energy of high-powered commerce. I bypassed the main reception desk and walked directly toward the private executive elevator bank. I knew exactly where I was going. I pressed the button for the 42nd floor. The elevator climbed silently, my ears popping slightly from the rapid change in altitude. When the silver doors parted, I stepped out into a lavish, remarkably intimidating reception area. The wall behind the polished desk proudly displayed the bold metallic letters of Pierce and Sterling, one of the most ruthless, feared, and effective corporate litigation firms on the entire eastern seaboard. I approached the desk. The young receptionist looked up, offering a practiced, professional smile. Before she could ask for my name, the heavy frosted glass doors leading to the inner offices swung open. A tall, impeccably dressed man with sharp features and incredibly cold, calculating eyes stepped into the reception area. It was Gregory Pierce. He was not a family lawyer. He did not handle petty domestic disputes. He was a corporate apex predator. He was the exact man who had aggressively negotiated the sale of my commercial engineering firm a decade ago, systematically dismantling the opposing legal team and securing a massive payout that formed the bulk of my stolen retirement fund. Gregory stopped mid-stride, his cold eyes locking onto my face. A genuine smile broke through his harsh, professional demeanor. "Harrison," he said, his deep voice carrying across the quiet room. "You are the absolute last person I expected to see walking through those doors today. I told my assistant to clear my entire morning schedule the second you called the emergency line." I stepped forward and shook his hand. His grip was firm, radiating an intense, highly capable energy. "It is very good to see you again, Gregory," I replied, my voice steady and completely void of the trembling frailty I had weaponized against my son. "I appreciate you taking the extra time on such an incredibly short notice." Gregory locked the doors of his private boardroom. The atmosphere was intensely serious, insulated by thick acoustic glass that completely silenced the city below. He gestured for me to take the executive chair opposite his position. He did not offer me coffee or engage in meaningless small talk. He knew the situation required immediate surgical precision. I placed my briefcase on the mahogany surface and clicked the latches open. I did not waste time with emotional preludes. I pulled out the evidence of my son and his betrayal. I slid the taped margin call document across the table. Next, I placed the digital banking logs and transfer receipts documenting the unauthorized liquidation of my entire $2 million retirement portfolio. Gregory then began to read. For 10 minutes, the only sound was the soft rustling of paper. I watched his eyes scan the financial data. I watched his jaw tighten. When he finally lowered his glasses, the welcoming colleague was gone. In his place sat the ruthless corporate litigator who terrorized opposing counsel a decade prior. He looked at me, tapping his gold pen. "Harrison," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous pitch. "This is not just elder financial abuse. This is a highly coordinated multi-million-dollar wire fraud operation. Your son has exposed himself to severe federal criminal charges." I nodded slowly, keeping my posture completely rigid. "I am fully aware of the criminal implications, Gregory. But a man facing a $3.2 million margin call from a predatory shadow lender does not forge the digital signature of his father just to buy time. He is desperately trying to plug a massive hole in a sinking ship. The missing funds only account for a fraction of the total liability. I need to know the absolute depth of the crater he has dug. I need you to pull the property records for the Weston estate." Gregory did not hesitate. He swiveled his leather chair toward the massive smartboard mounted on the far wall. He typed in his highly secure login credentials, bypassing standard search portals to access direct unredacted county financial databases. He entered the exact address of the Weston property. The screen flickered instantly, populating with dense columns of property deeds, tax assessments, and recorded municipal liens. Gregory scrolled through the initial purchase agreements, noting my massive 80% cash contribution from 3 years ago. Then he applied a specific filter, searching for secondary encumbrances and active lines of credit. The screen refreshed once more. Gregory leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he processed the newly generated data. He let out a sharp, incredulous breath. The silence in the room became incredibly heavy. He turned back to face me, his expression grim. "Harrison." He began, his tone carrying the solemn weight of a medical examiner delivering a terminal diagnosis. "You correctly deduced that your missing $2 million was only a fraction of the total catastrophe. The financial puzzle you have been trying to solve just found its missing piece, and it is absolutely devastating." He tapped a key on his console, highlighting a specific massive line item on the smartboard. The bright yellow highlight illuminated a catastrophic legal reality. Gregory dropped the bombshell with absolute precision. 18 months ago, Bradley completely leveraged the structural equity of your property. He secretly took out a home equity line of credit against the Weston estate. He did not just borrow a small sum for renovations. He maxed out the absolute structural limit of the property value. He secured a secondary loan for a staggering $2 million. I sat perfectly still, processing the sheer, astronomical scale of my son and his financial recklessness. Because I had generously paid 80% of the total home purchase price in cash, the property was incredibly equity-rich from the very first day. It was a massive untapped reservoir of capital sitting quietly in the suburbs. Bradley had looked at my generous paternal gift and seen nothing but a massive unsecured bank. He had systematically bled it dry. Gregory pointed his gold pen at the illuminated figures on the board. The mechanics of his failure are completely transparent, Harrison. Bradley used the massive equity you established to secure this line of credit. He then took that $2 million and funneled it directly into highly volatile, highly leveraged offshore investments. When those aggressive market positions inevitably collapsed, he desperately turned to Apex Capital Solutions to cover his massive losses. He used the house as collateral for the first disaster, and then he used your stolen retirement portfolio to frantically pay down the shadow lenders. He has essentially burned through $4 million of your money in less than 2 years. The profound magnitude of the betrayal settled over me like a suffocating physical weight. My son had not simply made a poor investment choice. He had engineered a comprehensive, multi-tiered financial suicide pact, using my life savings as the primary fuel. He had leveraged the roof over my head to the absolute brink of foreclosure. Gregory turned off the smartboard, allowing the room to return to its dim, serious ambiance. He folded his hands together on the mahogany desk. "The shadow lenders are not your primary immediate threat," Harrison Gregory explained, his voice entirely devoid of sympathy for my son. "The primary bank holding this massive home equity line of credit has already registered multiple consecutive missed payments. According to these public filings, the grace period expired 3 days ago. If Bradley cannot magically produce the minimum required capital to satisfy this specific lien, the bank will officially call the loan. They will immediately initiate hostile seizure protocols. You do not have months to sort this out. If the bank moves forward, the Weston estate will be fully seized and locked down within exactly 30 days. I looked down at my hands resting quietly on the polished wood of the boardroom table. They were perfectly steady. The final piece of the puzzle had firmly locked into place, revealing a picture of unadulterated, unforgivable greed. Bradley was frantically trying to lock me away in a dementia ward by Friday because he knew the bank examiners were coming. He needed me legally incapacitated so he could blame the missing funds on my supposedly failing mind, allowing him to quietly declare bankruptcy and walk away from the smoking crater of our family. He needed me erased, but I was still sitting at the table. I looked up at Gregory, letting the cold, calculating nature of my engineering background completely overwrite any lingering paternal instinct. "I am not going to let him sink my ship, Gregory. I want you to immediately draft the legal paperwork to contest the medical proxy. I want federal wire fraud charges prepared and ready to file the second I give the absolute command. And most importantly, I want you to figure out exactly how we can legally rip that house out from under him before the bank can take it." Gregory Pierce smiled. It was the terrifying, genuine smile of an apex predator who had just been invited to a slaughter. "Let us get to work." Gregory Pierce pivoted his leather chair toward the massive smartboard, his fingers flying across the wireless keyboard. I watched the display screen as encrypted financial pathways were forced open by Gregory's forensic software. Bradley attempted to hide the funds by routing them through offshore shell companies, but his methodology was amateurish against a legal predator of Gregory's caliber. Within 20 minutes, the convoluted web of international transfers began to unravel, revealing a highly localized target. Gregory leaned forward, scanning the destination ledger. The money had not vanished into a random stock gamble. Bradley had pooled my life savings and his own leveraged equity, pouring every cent into a massive commercial real estate venture. Gregory tapped the screen, bringing up the project specifics. It was a sprawling luxury commercial complex proposed for the highly coveted waterfront district. The lead developer orchestrating this monumental project was a megacorporation known globally as Cross Holdings. Bradley had bet his entire existence and my retirement on a backdoor syndicate investment attached to this specific waterfront development. He bypassed traditional investment channels, opting for an unregulated shadow position that promised exponential returns. But the digital records told a story of sudden failure. Gregory pulled up the municipal public records associated with the Cross Holdings project. The entire venture had recently hit an impenetrable brick wall. The City Zoning Commission unexpectedly denied the required commercial permits. Without those permits, the waterfront development was paralyzed. The land could not be developed, and the influx of speculative capital was lost. Bradley's unregulated shadow investment evaporated overnight. That was the specific event that directly triggered his massive catastrophic margin call. Gregory leaned back, looking at me with professional disgust. "Your son is a spectacular fool, Harrison. He bought into a highly predatory syndicate attached to a corporate giant. When the zoning permits failed, Cross Holdings easily absorbed the initial delay. They are a multi-billion-dollar entity capable of waiting out a bureaucratic storm." Bradley, however, was playing with stolen leveraged money. His shadow lenders immediately demanded their capital back. He is completely ruined. He does not have legal standing to complain because he used stolen funds. He does not know the people who orchestrate Cross Holdings. He is a microscopic parasite crushed when the giant took a backward step. I sat perfectly still in the quiet boardroom, staring blankly at the massive smartboard. The glowing logo of Cross Holdings filled the digital screen. A strange sensation washed over me. It was not anger. It was not panic. It was a profound sense of cosmic irony. The corners of my mouth slowly turned upward, forming a deeply satisfied smile. Gregory frowned, confused by my sudden shift in demeanor. He had just confirmed the absolute evaporation of my life savings, and I was smiling like a man who had won a lottery. Harrison, Gregory said, his voice laced with cautious concern. "I know this is an incredible shock. Your son committed an unforgivable financial crime. We can go after him, but recovering the actual cash from a failed syndicate linked to Cross Holdings is going to be an impossible legal battle. They are an unstoppable corporate machine." I raised my hand, gently silencing the ruthless attorney. I kept my eyes locked directly on the corporate logo. "I am not worried about fighting Cross Holdings, Gregory. I do not believe a legal battle will be necessary at all." Bradley clearly did his research on profit margins, but failed to do historical research on the corporation itself. He has absolutely no idea who actually owns and operates Cross Holdings. Gregory tilted his head, his sharp eyes studying my face. "And you do?" I nodded slowly, letting the memories of a lifetime ago surface with absolute clarity. 30 years ago, Cross Holdings was not a global megacorporation. It was a struggling local development firm run by a young, fiercely ambitious man named Victor Cross. Victor was trying to make his mark in the commercial construction industry, but he ran afoul of a highly corrupt city council. They wanted a massive bribe for a specific infrastructure project. When Victor absolutely refused to pay their extortion fee, they decided to destroy him. A newly constructed municipal bridge built using materials supplied by Victor's company suffered a catastrophic structural failure. The city council immediately blamed Victor, presenting fabricated evidence that he had knowingly supplied highly defective steel. They were prepared to send an innocent man to federal prison for decades just to cover up their own systemic corruption. At that exact time, I was working as an independent structural engineer. The city council hired me to officially review the failure, fully expecting me to simply sign off on their fabricated report. But I did not. I conducted a rigorous, completely independent analysis of the collapsed bridge. I discovered the undeniable truth. The steel Victor supplied was flawless. The structural failure was entirely caused by the city council's own corrupt inspectors who intentionally altered the load-bearing specifications to siphon municipal funds into their pockets. The entire city was terrified of the council. No one wanted to speak out. But I was not afraid of corrupt politicians. I stood up in a crowded federal courtroom and presented my exact structural findings. I systematically dismantled the city council's fabricated narrative. I mathematically proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that Victor Cross was completely innocent. My testimony destroyed the corrupt officials and exonerated the young developer. He walked out of that courtroom a free man. A week after the trial concluded, Victor Cross came directly to my private engineering office. He was weeping with profound gratitude. He reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out his personal checkbook, and signed his name at the bottom of a blank check. He slid it across my desk and told me to write down any number I wanted. He said I had saved his life, his freedom, and his future, and he wanted to properly compensate me for my incredible bravery. I picked up the blank check, looked the young man directly in the eyes, and slowly tore the paper into tiny pieces. I let the shredded paper fall into my wastebasket. I told him I did not testify for money. I testified because the structural mathematics demanded the absolute truth. I told him I did not need his wealth. I leaned across the desk and offered him a firm handshake. I told him I do not need your money, Victor. You just owe me a favor. I returned my focus to the present moment, looking across the mahogany boardroom table at Gregory Pierce. The ruthless attorney was staring at me in stunned silence. He fully grasped the monumental implication of my story. Bradley poured my stolen money into a project controlled by Victor Cross, I said, my voice resonating with cold authority. My son thinks he is dealing with a faceless, impenetrable corporate giant. He has no idea that the apex predator of that corporation owes me his entire life. Gregory, I want you to draft the criminal fraud papers for my son. But before we file anything, I need you to find a private phone number. It is time for me to call in a 30-year-old favor. I left Gregory Pierce sitting in his magnificent boardroom, armed with the private, unlisted contact information for Victor Cross. The pieces of my ultimate retaliation were finally assembled on the legal chessboard, but I still needed to understand the absolute granular reality of my son's panic. By Thursday evening, the heavy atmosphere inside the Weston estate had become completely toxic. It was the eve of my scheduled involuntary eviction to Sunset Pines. Bradley and Monica were avoiding each other entirely, moving through the massive house like trapped, terrified animals. The air was thick with unspoken terror. I retreated to my guest room immediately after a silent, agonizingly tense dinner. I locked the heavy wooden door, turned off the overhead lights, and sat down in the dark. It was time to harvest the digital crop I had planted the previous day. I pulled my secure mobile phone from my pocket and activated the encrypted receiver program. I bypassed the compromised home network, entirely reaching out directly to the 2 micro-recording devices I had surgically embedded into the dining room chandelier and the leather lining of Bradley's executive desk chair. The synchronization process took exactly 30 seconds. The digital progress bar filled with a satisfying, silent efficiency. I downloaded 48 hours of continuous high-definition audio files directly onto my local encrypted drive. I plugged a pair of noise-canceling headphones into my device, ensuring absolutely no sound would bleed through the quiet guest room. I settled back into my reading chair, completely isolating my senses, and pressed play on the most recent file downloaded from the home office. The audio quality was terrifyingly crisp. I could hear the soft synthetic squeak of the expensive leather as Bradley aggressively paced behind his massive desk. I could hear the ragged, shallow cadence of his breathing. Then the rapid dialing tones echoed loudly in my ears, followed immediately by the sharp click of an answered line. Bradley did not introduce himself. He immediately launched into a frantic, high-pitched string of desperate pleas. He was begging. But the man on the other end of the line was not a traditional banking executive. He was not a municipal loan officer, and he was absolutely not a corporate representative from Apex Capital Solutions. The voice emanating from my headphones was low, gravelly, and entirely devoid of professional courtesy. It possessed the cold, mechanical detachment of a man who dealt exclusively in physical violence and absolute control. As I listened to the agonizing exchange, the true, horrifying depth of Bradley's incompetence finally revealed itself. The margin call document I had meticulously reconstructed from the shredded trash was indeed real. but it was merely the secondary wave of an infinitely more destructive blast. When the Cross Holdings waterfront project initially stalled, and his primary shadow lenders demanded their collateral, Bradley had desperately tried to salvage his massive leveraged position. He had frantically sought a massive bridge loan to keep his investments afloat and hide the missing $2 million he stole from me. But traditional banks had already flagged his toxic debt-to-income ratio, so my highly educated, supposedly brilliant son had bypassed the financial district entirely. He had walked directly into the brutal, unforgiving grip of the criminal underworld. Apex Capital Solutions was merely a legitimate-looking corporate facade. Bradley had actually borrowed an additional $5 million directly from a ruthless, highly organized Boston crime syndicate posing as a boutique hedge fund. The profound stupidity of his actions practically defied logical comprehension. He had leveraged a stolen fortune to borrow money from murderers. The two men in the cheap, poorly fitted dark suits who had parked aggressively in our driveway on Tuesday morning were not bank appraisers. They were not municipal foreclosure scouts checking property lines for a bank seizure. They were mob enforcers. They had not come to evaluate the structural integrity of the roof or document the landscaping boundaries. They had come to physically mark their territory, assert total dominance, and deliver a final, non-negotiable ultimatum directly to my son. I listened intently as the gravelly voice on the recording systematically stripped away every single ounce of Bradley's remaining corporate arrogance. The enforcer did not care about the stalling zoning permits. He did not care about the complex legal maneuvering of Cross Holdings. He only cared about the mathematical reality of the debt. The enforcer was explicitly terrifyingly clear. The $5 million principal, combined with a staggering extortionate interest fee that compounded daily, was due in exactly 48 hours. The deadline was Friday afternoon. The exact same afternoon, Bradley had arranged for the medical transport van to permanently remove me from the estate. It was a perfectly synchronized timeline of total destruction. Bradley was planning to physically eliminate me from the equation, legally seize my remaining assets, using the fraudulently obtained medical proxy, and hand everything over to the syndicate to buy himself a few more weeks of breathing room. He was literally planning to feed his own father to the wolves to save his own skin. The voice on the recording dropped to a menacing quiet whisper. The mob enforcer delivered the final terms with chilling precision. If the funds were not wired into their designated offshore account by Friday at 5 o'clock in the evening, they were not going to initiate a lengthy legal foreclosure process. They were not going to file civil lawsuits or seize the imported luxury vehicles in the driveway. They were going to come back to the quiet, pristine Weston estate and take his life. The recording captured Bradley collapsing heavily into his leather chair. I heard the pathetic, ragged sound of my grown son sobbing into his hands. He wept with the absolute crushing realization that he had engineered his own violent execution. I reached up and slowly removed the headphones, placing them gently on the small wooden desk. The silent guest room felt different now. It was no longer a temporary holding cell for a discarded elder. He had invited violent criminals directly to our front door. The stakes had instantly elevated from corporate fraud to physical survival. But he possessed absolutely no idea who he was dealing with. He thought he was the smartest man in the room, playing a high-stakes game of corporate chess. In reality, he was a frightened child who had wandered blindly into a minefield. I sat perfectly still in the dark, my mind calibrating the terrifying new parameters of the battlefield. The timeline was absolute. Friday afternoon was the deadline for both my forced eviction and his violent execution. The syndicate was coming for their money, and Bradley was completely powerless to stop them. But I was not powerless. I possessed the entire digital layout of his fraud. I possessed the pristine, unlisted contact information for the billionaire who inadvertently triggered this collapse. And I possessed the cold, mechanical patience of a man who had spent 40 years designing structures built to withstand catastrophic pressure. I stood up and moved toward the window, looking out over the dark, quiet lawn. The trap was set. The enemies were approaching, and I was absolutely ready for war. I kept the headphones pressed firmly against my ears, refusing to pause the recording. The silence in Bradley's office stretched on for several agonizing minutes after the mob enforcer disconnected the call. I could hear my son gasping for air, his breath hitching, as the absolute reality of his impending execution settled over him. He was a broken, terrified creature, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own catastrophic arrogance. I waited for any fragment of human decency to surface. Instead, I heard the heavy double doors of the home office swing open. The click of Monica's designer heels echoed across the hardwood floor. She did not rush to comfort her hyperventilating husband. There were no soft words of reassurance about the violent threats he had just received. She had clearly been listening from the hallway, absorbing the entire horrifying exchange. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was not trembling with fear. It was chillingly calm, devoid of empathy, and vibrating with an icy, calculated precision. She told Bradley to pull himself together. She told him that panicking would only accelerate their destruction. Bradley tried to speak his words, stumbling over his terror, babbling about the enforcers and the 48-hour deadline. Monica cut him off immediately. I sat motionless in the dark guest room as my daughter-in-law effortlessly transitioned from a suburban housewife into a ruthless, pragmatic strategist. She did not care about the moral implications of stealing my life savings. She only cared about logistics, survival, and securing their escape. She began to lay out the final phase of their deception with a level of cruelty that stole the breath from my lungs. She told Bradley that the $2 million they had already stolen from my retirement portfolio was gone, and they could not magically recover it from the failed Cross Holdings venture. But she noted I still possessed a secondary checking account and a small pension fund. It was not enough to satisfy the mob syndicate, but it was more than enough to fund a relocation. Bradley whimpered, asking how they could possibly access those remaining funds when the bank was already demanding my physical presence for any further withdrawals. That was when Monica delivered the betrayal. Her words flowed through the digital recording with absolute clarity. She told him that the medical proxy would give them total, uncontested legal authority over every single asset attached to my name. Bradley argued that I would figure it out, that I would immediately call the police the second I saw the missing money. Monica let out a soft, condescending laugh. She told her husband that I would not be calling anyone. As soon as the old man is in Sunset Pines, she explained, we execute the proxy. I already paid a massive cash bribe directly to the facility director. He is going straight into the locked dementia ward on the 4th floor. I closed my eyes in the dark, visualizing the sterile, inescapable nightmare she was casually constructing for me. She systematically listed the protocols of my impending imprisonment. There would be no incoming or outgoing phone calls permitted. There would be no visitors allowed. She had explicitly instructed the corrupt facility director to confiscate my personal belongings, deny me access to communication devices, and keep me heavily medicated. She was engineering a scenario where my absolute truth would be documented as the tragic, paranoid delusions of a rapidly deteriorating mind. I would be completely buried alive within the medical system, silenced forever. Bradley's breathing began to steady on the recording. He was clinging to her monstrous plan like a life raft. He asked her about the syndicate. Monica's response was sharp and devoid of hesitation. She told him they were going to exercise the medical proxy the very second the doors locked behind me at Sunset Pines. They were going to instantly liquidate my remaining checking accounts, drain the pension fund pack, whatever jewelry and untraceable assets they could fit into a single duffel bag, and abandon the Weston estate completely. They were going to take my last remaining dollar's drive straight to the private airfield and board a chartered flight to a non-extradition territory before the syndicate even realized they were gone. And what about him? Bradley asked, his voice weak, finally referring to me. What happens when the facility stops getting paid? What happens when the money for Sunset Pines runs out? Monica did not even pause to consider the moral weight of her answer. She scoffed, the sound dripping with disgust. Who cares, she spat. Once the initial deposit dries up, the facility will just transfer him to a state-run ward. He will be completely broke and permanently locked away. He won't be able to report the forged signatures to the police. Let the state change his diapers. We will be sitting on a beach, and he will not even remember his own name. The recording clicked and went completely silent as the audio file ended. The absolute quiet of my guest room rushed back in, but the atmosphere had fundamentally altered. I reached up and slowly pulled the noise-canceling headphones away from my ears. I set them down on the wooden desk with deliberate care. My hands resting on my knees were completely steady. There was no tremor of sorrow. There was no lingering shock. The final fraction of paternal mercy I had been holding onto for my son instantly evaporated, replaced by a cold, crystalline resolve. They had calculated my total destruction. They had priced out my sanity, my freedom, and my dignity, trading it all for a cowardly escape from the violent criminals they had foolishly courted. I stood up from the reading chair and walked across the dark room to my travel bag. I did not turn on the overhead light. I did not need illumination. I unzipped the side compartment and reached deep into the secondary lining. My fingers brushed against the worn leather of a small, heavy book. I pulled it out into the dim moonlight, filtering through the window. It was my personal address directory. It was a physical relic from a time before digital contacts and cloud synchronization, bound in thick black leather and filled with the names of men who built empires. I opened the weathered cover. The pages were slightly yellowed. I bypassed the recent entries and turned directly to the letter C. I ran my finger down the column of names until I found the specific entry I had written exactly 30 years ago. It was not a corporate office line. It was not a public relations contact. It was a highly secure, heavily guarded private mobile number. It was the direct lifeline to a man who grew into a titan. I pulled my cellular device from my pocket. I opened the dialer. I punched in the sequence of numbers. I pressed the button and raised the phone to my ear. The line rang exactly twice. There was only heavy, expectant silence. "Victor," I said, my voice resonating with unwavering authority in the dark. "It is Harrison Thorne. I am officially cashing in that 30-year-old favor." The brief conversation with Victor Cross was the most efficient exchange of my entire life. He did not ask for explanations. He did not question my motives. He simply asked for my current location and told me to be ready by 9 o'clock on Friday morning. I slept deeply that night, enveloped in absolute tranquility. When the sun finally rose on Friday, painting the Weston estate in pale light, I did not feel like an old man facing eviction. I dressed with deliberate care. I selected a crisp white dress shirt, a charcoal gray wool blazer, and dark tailored trousers. I packed my small travel bag, ensuring my encrypted laptop and engineering toolkit were securely fastened inside. The man staring back at me was cold, sovereign, and ready for the final act of this theatrical nightmare. I opened the wooden door and walked down the sweeping mahogany staircase. The atmosphere was suffocating with panic. The mob deadline was only hours away, and that reality was destroying my son. It was exactly 9 o'clock. I walked into the kitchen and found Bradley standing near the granite island. His skin was pale and slick with a cold sweat. He was aggressively checking his expensive wristwatch every few seconds, his eyes darting frantically toward the front windows. He was a cornered, terrified animal waiting for the slaughter. Monica stood near the expensive espresso machine, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She wore dark designer sunglasses inside the house, likely to hide the dark circles of her own sleepless panic. They both froze when I entered the room. They looked at my sharp attire, my packed suitcase, and my perfectly steady posture. They expected a crying, terrified old man begging to stay. Instead, they got a stoic figure radiating quiet, absolute authority. Bradley could not process the shift. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest. "Time is up, old man," he barked, his voice cracking with desperate, pathetic rage. "The medical transport van is on its way right now. They will be here in 20 minutes to take you to Sunset Pines. You have absolutely no choices left. You either sign that medical proxy right now, or I will throw you and your suitcase directly out onto the curb. I looked at the legal document resting on the kitchen island. It was printed on thick paper, complete with a blue ink pen resting perfectly parallel to the signature line. It was the instrument they intended to use to steal my pension and fund their cowardly flight from the violent criminals they had courted. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I simply reached out and picked up the blue ink pen. Bradley let out a ragged sigh of relief. He thought his intimidation had finally broken my spirit. Monica stepped forward, a cruel, triumphant smirk pulling at the corners of her mouth. I held the pen over the signature line for a single heavy second. Then I calmly placed the pen down on the granite surface exactly where I had found it. I left the document completely unsigned. I looked Bradley directly in the eyes. His relief instantly vanished, replaced by a paralyzing wave of horror. I did not owe him a single word of explanation. I did not owe him anger or tears. I simply turned away, picked up my leather suitcase from the floor, and began to walk toward the front door. Bradley shouted something behind me, a garbled string of curses and desperate commands, but I ignored him entirely. My focus was on the heavy front door and the bright morning light waiting beyond it. I pulled the handle, stepping out onto the wide stone porch. The morning air was crisp and clean. I heard the rapid click of Monica and her heels following closely behind me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw her holding her expensive smartphone out in front of her, the camera lens pointed directly at my back. She wanted a digital alibi. She narrated the video with a sweet, mournful tone, completely masking the ruthless, predatory nature of her actual agenda. I ignored her performance and walked down the stone steps, moving with a strong, measured stride toward the end of the long driveway. Monica followed me, keeping the camera trained on my back, her voice dripping with fake sympathy for her imaginary audience. Bradley stumbled out onto the porch, gripping the stone pillar, his chest heaving as he watched his only escape plan simply walk away. I reached the edge of the property line and stopped. I set my suitcase down on the pristine paving stones. I did not look at Monica. I did not look back at the house. I simply looked down the quiet, manicured street, waiting for the inevitable arrival. Monica stepped closer, pointing the phone directly at my face. She told the camera that the transport van was coming to take me to a place where I would finally be safe. But the sound that suddenly shattered the quiet suburban morning was not the rattle of a cheap medical transport van. It was a deep, resonant, impossibly heavy mechanical roar. A massive pitch-black vehicle turned sharply onto our street. It was a fully armored, custom-extended Maybach limousine. The paint was so impossibly dark, it seemed to absorb the morning light. The tires were incredibly thick, designed for tactical evasion, and the windows were tinted to an absolute impenetrable black. The sheer physical presence of the vehicle radiated an overwhelming, crushing authority. The massive engine roared as the limousine accelerated down the street, stopping with aggressive precision directly in front of the Weston estate. It completely blocked the end of our driveway. Monica stopped recording. She lowered her smartphone, her mouth falling open in complete, unadulterated shock. Bradley froze on the porch, his eyes wide with absolute terror. He thought the Boston crime syndicate had arrived early to collect his life. 4 men stepped outside. They wore immaculate, tailored, dark clothing. They moved with the silent, fluid precision of highly trained, tactical security operatives. 2 men immediately took up defensive positions at the front and rear bumpers of the massive vehicle, their eyes scanning the street for potential threats. The other 2 men walked directly toward me, bypassing Monica entirely as if she simply did not exist. The lead security operative stopped exactly 3 feet in front of me. He offered a crisp, perfectly executed nod of profound respect. He reached down and picked up my heavy leather suitcase with effortless ease. The second operative stepped forward firmly, grasping the polished handle of the armored rear passenger door. He pulled it open, revealing the luxurious, immaculate interior of the massive limousine. I turned my head very slowly and looked at Monica. The cruel, triumphant smirk was completely gone. Her designer sunglasses could not hide the sheer, paralyzing panic radiating from her entire body. I looked past her, fixing my gaze on Bradley, who was currently trembling violently on the stone porch, desperately clutching the pillar as if the ground were collapsing beneath his feet. The trap was springing perfectly. I buttoned the front of my charcoal blazer, turned my back on their total destruction, and calmly stepped into the waiting fortress. Before my polished leather shoe could cross the threshold of the massive Maybach, a figure shifted within the dark plush interior. The lead security operative took a respectful step backward, holding the heavy armored door wide open. Out stepped Victor Cross. 30 years had transformed the desperate, weeping young developer into an absolute titan of global industry. He wore an immaculate midnight blue tailored suit that radiated quiet, devastating wealth. His hair was entirely silver, swept back with sharp precision, framing a face that had been hardened by decades of ruthless corporate warfare. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who owned entire city skylines. The sheer gravity of his physical presence seemed to warp the very air around him instantly, dwarfing the manicured suburban perfection of the Weston estate. He looked like an emperor arriving to survey a conquered territory and pass final judgment. I remained standing by the open door, watching the scene unfold with absolute cold satisfaction. On the stone porch, Bradley had stopped hyperventilating. The sheer, paralyzing terror of the looming mob deadline was momentarily overridden by a sudden, jarring shock of recognition. My son spent his entire existence obsessing over wealth, studying the profiles of billionaires, and worshiping the elite architects of the financial world. He knew exactly who had just stepped out of the armored limousine. He had stared at Victor Cross on the cover of Forbes magazine. He had watched him dominate financial news networks. And now the mythological architect of the commercial real estate venture that held his stolen fortune was standing directly at the end of our driveway. Bradley's fragile mind instantly fractured desperately, trying to assemble a narrative that allowed him to survive. In his profound, unadulterated arrogance, my son leaped to the most delusional conclusion possible. The transformation was nauseating to witness. The terrified, weeping coward who had just threatened to throw me onto the curb instantly vanished. In his place emerged the slick, sycophantic corporate climber. Bradley violently shoved past Monica, nearly knocking her off balance, and sprinted down the stone steps. He practically stumbled over the freshly manicured lawn in his desperate haste to reach the driveway. He completely ignored me. He did not even register my existence standing next to the massive vehicle. His wild, dilated eyes were locked entirely on the billionaire. He skidded to a halt just inches away from the perimeter, established by the tactical security operatives. One of the guards instantly raised a massive gloved hand, physically stopping my son from taking another step. Bradley was sweating profusely, his chest heaving, but he forced a wide, desperate, incredibly fake smile onto his face. "Mr. Cross," he gasped, his voice pitching upward in frantic, groveling excitement. "I am Bradley Thorne. We invested heavily in your waterfront commercial sector. We represent the secondary capital syndicate. I knew you would not let a minor zoning delay derail the project. I knew you would come to secure the bridge loans." Bradley reached his hand out eagerly, expecting a warm, validating handshake from his corporate idol. He stood there panting, completely blind to the reality of his own doom. Victor Cross did not extend his hand. He did not smile. He did not even blink. The billionaire looked right through my son, as if Bradley were nothing more than a minor distasteful smudge on a glass window. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and utterly suffocating. Victor slowly turned his head away from the sweating, desperate man. He bypassed Bradley entirely, gliding smoothly past the perimeter guards, and stopped directly in front of me. The titan of industry, a man who commanded legions of executives and controlled billions of dollars in global assets, slowly lowered his head. He offered me a deep, profound bow of absolute respect. It was a gesture of unadulterated reverence that shattered the morning air. When he finally stood straight, He turned his sharp, icy gaze toward Bradley and Monica. "Harrison, my old friend Victor," said his voice carrying the deep, lethal resonance of a firing squad commander. "Are these the parasites you wanted me to exterminate?" The words hung in the crisp suburban air, slicing through Bradley's corporate delusions with surgical precision. I watched my son physically recoil as if he had been struck by a high-speed train. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly translucent white. The extended, eager hand he had offered to the billionaire began to tremble violently before dropping limply to his side. The horrific, devastating realization finally crashed down upon him with brutal, overwhelming force. The intricate puzzle pieces of his impending destruction violently locked into place. He looked at me, standing tall and perfectly composed next to the man who held the absolute power of life and death over his financial existence. He realized with crushing clarity that I was not a helpless, discarded old man waiting for a medical transport van. I was the architect of his ruin. He had tried to defraud a billionaire's closest ally. Monica suddenly dropped her expensive smartphone onto the paving stones. The digital device shattered, but she did not even blink. She brought both of her trembling hands up to cover her mouth, letting out a faint, strangled gasp of pure terror. She finally understood the magnitude of their colossal miscalculation. They had planned to lock me away in a dementia ward and flee the country with my stolen pension, assuming I was completely powerless. They never anticipated that I possessed the capacity to summon a corporate leviathan to our front door. Victor Cross adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit, his gaze never leaving my son. "I received your detailed financial dossier," Harrison Victor continued, his tone conversational, but laced with absolute menace. "The forensic accounting was flawless. Your son attempted to hide his unauthorized transfers through a series of pathetic offshore shell companies, but my internal analysts completely dismantled his amateur framework in less than an hour. He used your stolen life savings to buy into a highly volatile shadow syndicate attached to my waterfront development. He assumed he was riding the coattails of my success. But the moment my project encountered a temporary bureaucratic delay, his predatory lenders demanded immediate repayment. Now he is drowning in toxic debt and facing the very real threat of physical violence from the Boston criminal underworld." Bradley let out a pathetic, trembling, high-pitched whimper. His knees buckled slightly, unable to support the weight of his own profound failure. He opened his mouth desperately, trying to formulate an apology, a plea for mercy, or a cowardly excuse, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He was utterly paralyzed by the crushing reality of his situation. The billionaire had perfectly summarized the exact parameters of his doom. I looked down at my sweating, trembling son, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, clinical detachment, as he finally comprehended the terrifying trap he had built for himself. The paternal bond had been permanently severed the moment they plotted to erase my existence. The final phase of my absolute retaliation was now officially in motion, and I would not show him a single ounce of mercy. I stepped back out of the luxurious interior of the armored Maybach, my polished shoes touching the pavement. I did not close the heavy door. Instead, I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out my secure mobile phone. I tapped the screen, synchronizing my device with the massive, high-fidelity exterior audio system built directly into the tactical vehicle. The synchronization paired instantly, a faint beep confirming the connection. I pressed play on the unedited digital file I had harvested from his office the night before. The crisp, horrifying audio echoed across the manicured lawn of the Weston estate, amplified to a deafening volume. Monica's voice cut through the crisp suburban morning, chilling and deeply calculated. Her recorded words bounced off the stone facade of the house. "As soon as the old man is in Sunset Pines, we execute the proxy. I already paid the facility director to put him in the locked dementia ward. No phones, no visitors. He won't be able to report the forged signatures to the police. We sell whatever is left in his name, take the cash, and flee to non-extradition territory. Let the state change his diapers." The recording played clearly for the entire neighborhood to hear. I pressed a button, and the audio went silent. The absolute quiet that followed was far more devastating than the noise. Bradley and Monica stood frozen on the stone porch, their faces contorted in absolute horror. The impenetrable secrecy of their murderous conspiracy was completely shattered. They could not hide behind excuses or pretend it was a misunderstanding. Their exact malicious intentions were broadcast into the open air. Victor Cross stepped forward, his polished shoes crunching softly on the driveway. He reached inside his tailored midnight blue jacket and produced a thick stack of legal documents bound in a heavy leather folder. He held the papers out, his silver hair catching the morning light. He looked at Bradley with a gaze so intensely cold, it seemed to freeze the blood in my son's veins. "I am a man who deals in absolute leverage," Victor stated, his voice resonating with lethal authority. "When Harrison contacted me last night and explained the situation, I made a few private phone calls. I reached out directly to the Boston syndicate you foolishly borrowed money from. Criminals are incredibly predictable. They prefer clean capital over messy executions. I bought your $5 million debt from your shadow lenders last night, Bradley. I purchased it in full. You do not owe the mob anymore. You owe me. And I collect immediately." Bradley let out a pathetic, high-pitched gasp. The sudden realization that his debt had not vanished, but had simply transferred to an unstoppable billionaire titan completely broke him. His legs gave out, and he collapsed onto his knees on the stone pathway. I stepped past Victor and looked down at the pathetic creature I had raised. The paternal illusion was entirely dead. "You have two choices, son," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any lingering affection. "Door number one is incredibly simple. My attorney, Gregory Pierce, is currently sitting in the district attorney's office. He is holding incontrovertible proof of your forged digital signatures, your massive wire fraud, and your conspired elder abuse. You and your wife will both go to federal prison for 20 years. There will be no leniency and no escape." Bradley sobbed, covering his face with his shaking hands. Monica took a step backward, shaking her head in violent denial. "Door number two," I continued, holding out a single sheet of paper I had pulled from my own travel bag. "You sign this quitclaim deed right now. You transfer 100% of the equity and ownership of this house solely back to me. You walk off this property immediately with absolutely nothing but the clothes currently on your back. And you spend the rest of your miserable life working minimum wage jobs to pay back Victor's $5 million debt. You will live in poverty, but you will live outside of a federal cage." Monica let out a piercing, hysterical scream. The illusion of her glamorous suburban life disintegrated in a fraction of a second. She turned her furious, tear-filled eyes toward Bradley, realizing she was now legally tied to a completely penniless man saddled with a $5 million unbankruptable debt to a ruthless billionaire. She did not hesitate. She did not offer a word of comfort or solidarity. She violently pulled the massive diamond engagement ring off her finger and threw it directly at Bradley's chest. The diamond bounced off his shirt and rolled into the grass. She turned on her heels and sprinted down the street, running away as fast as she could, abandoning her husband without a single backward glance. She did not even stop to grab her designer purse or her luxury car keys from the foyer. Her survival instincts completely overrode any lingering marital loyalty. She simply vanished into the morning, leaving Bradley to face the absolute totality of the wrath he had summoned. Bradley remained on his knees, weeping uncontrollably. He looked up at me, his eyes begging for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. I simply pointed to the smooth black hood of the armored Maybach. I placed the quitclaim deed on the polished metal and set the blue ink pen beside it. Bradley dragged himself up from the ground. He practically crawled toward the vehicle. His hands shook violently as he picked up the pen. He wept loudly, tears falling onto the legal document as he hastily scrawled his signature, legally surrendering his entire fraudulent empire. His tears smeared the ink, but the signature was legally binding. It was the exact instrument of his own ruin executed by his own trembling hand. I picked up the signed deed, carefully folded it, and placed it securely inside my breast pocket. I looked at the broken man on the ground, one final time feeling only the cold closure of a structural equation balancing itself out. I did not offer a final farewell. I did not look back. I simply turned around and stepped into the luxurious interior of the limousine. Victor Cross followed me, closing the heavy armored door with a solid, echoing thud. The engine roared to life, its deep vibration shaking the pavement, and the tactical vehicle glided smoothly down the street, leaving my son weeping alone on the curb of the life he had systematically destroyed. Within exactly 30 days, Gregory Pierce legally finalized the permanent eviction and sold the Weston estate for a massive premium to an overseas investor. I successfully recovered my entire stolen retirement portfolio from those highly lucrative financial proceeds, securing my personal future. I then used the massive remaining surplus to fully fund a highly prestigious permanent structural engineering scholarship at my beloved alma mater, establishing it eternally in my late wife's memory. I know she would have been immensely proud of my unyielding resilience and my absolutely flawless strategic survival. I meticulously secured my legacy, completely erased their treacherous betrayal forever, and finally found my lasting quiet peace. Family is not defined solely by blood. It is defined by respect, loyalty, and how they treat you when they believe you have no power left. Never allow your unconditional love for your children to blind you to their actions. When you sacrifice everything to give someone a perfect life, you risk raising entitled individuals who view you as a resource rather than a human being. Setting fierce, immovable boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of personal respect. You cannot control the greed of others, but you absolutely control whether you become their victim. If this story proved that true justice comes to those who refuse to be silent victims, hit the like button and subscribe. Tell me in the comments what you would have done to Bradley. I read every single comment. See you in the next story. Stay strong and stay vigilant.